IOC announces new eligibility rule. Women's Olympic events restricted to biological females from late 2028. The International Olympic Committee has introduced a major policy shift regarding participation in women's Olympic events, confirming that eligibility will be limited to biological females beginning with the Los Angeles 2028 Olympic Games. Now it's time to dig into the details of this story on the AI podcast.
Usually when we talk about sports, the rules are something you can just plainly see. I mean, they're drawn in stark white chalk on a grass field, or they're, measured down to the millisecond by a digital stopwatch.
Right, yeah. Or defined by the literal iron weight of a barbell. It's highly visible, physical, and completely out in the open.
Exactly. If a runner steps out of his lane, a referee blows a whistle, a flag goes up, the metric is objective, and everyone in the stadium, and everyone watching at home for that matter, understands the exact physical boundary that was crossed.
But if you look at how sports govern who actually gets to step onto that field in the first place, specifically in the women's category, those clear white lines just completely disappear.
Yeah, they really do. We're looking at a regulatory landscape that has been incredibly complex, highly subjective, and honestly drastically different depending on which sport you happen to be watching on any given day.
Oh, absolutely. Which is why today we're looking at a fundamental reimagining of how elite sporting institutions categorize human biology. This is driven entirely by a newly mandated standard from the International Olympic Committee, the IOC.
Right. Now, before we get into the biological mechanics and the timeline of all this, I want to make a quick but really important note directly to you, our listener.
Yeah, this is crucial.
The source material we're unpacking today for this deep dive touches on global debates that are intensely personal and, as you know, highly politically charged. We want to be exceptionally clear right out of the gate. Neither of us are taking sides on this issue.
No, not at all.
We aren't endorsing any political viewpoints, and we're definitely not advocating for any specific policy. Our only goal here is to impartially report and unpack the facts, the scientific ideas, and the historical context contained entirely within the source material we have in front of us.
Exactly. Our job is synthesis, plain and simple. We are taking a magnifying glass to the mechanism of a major historic institutional decision and just mapping out its direct consequences.
Okay, let's unpack this. The central premise of our source is that starting with the Los Angeles 2028 Olympics, the IOC is completely throwing out the old system.
Throwing that out entirely, yeah.
They're replacing this messy patchwork of individual federation rules with a single genetics-based standard to determine who can compete in the women's category.
Right, because the old system relied heavily on an incredibly complex web of testing. I mean, for years, different sports federations focused primarily on fluctuating hormone levels, specifically monitoring testosterone.
Which meant athletes were constantly being monitored.
Yes, exactly. Athletes were required to suppress those levels and constantly submit to testing to prove they were under a certain threshold. It was exhausting.
And it's subjective, too.
Very. So the IOC is abandoning that subjective fluctuating metric in favor of a single genetic checkpoint. Moving forward, any athlete aiming to compete in the women's category at the Olympics will have to undergo a one-time genetic screening test.
Now, genetics is a massive, incredibly dense field. To be clear, the IOC isn't sequencing an athlete's entire genome to look for, athletic prowess or something.
Oh, no. The test is highly targeted.
Right. It's looking specifically for the presence or absence of the SRY gene. And this particular gene is located on the Y chromosome, and biologically speaking, it is the primary catalyst that initiates male biological development in a human embryo.
Yeah, it acts as the initial domino in a very long biological chain reaction. So if an athlete tests positive for this SRY gene under this new policy, they are deemed entirely ineligible to compete in the women's category.
And the rollout is pretty straightforward, isn't it?
It is. The operational rollout described in the text is intentionally designed to be a definitive, one-time event per athlete. It uses minimally invasive procedures like a saliva sample, a standard cheek swab, or a routine blood test.
Let me put an analogy on this to visualize the administrative shift because I think it helps. Under the old rules, the eligibility process was essentially an ongoing negotiation.
Right, a constant back and forth.
An athlete was trapped in this cycle of monitoring their own blood work, suppressing their natural hormones with medication, submitting endless paperwork, And they might get approved by one specific sports governing body, but potentially get their credentials rejected by another. It was a moving target.
It was incredibly frustrating for everyone involved.
So this new SRY test functions like like a biological barcode scanner installed directly at the entry gate of the Olympic Village. You step up, you scan the barcode once. If it beeps green, your eligibility for the women's events is locked in for the rest of your career.
And if it beeps red,
You are turned away. It is a strict, unmoving binary checkpoint.
what's fascinating here is that administrative barcode scanner is exactly what the IOC is trying to build, and their justification relied heavily on the concept of a stable biological marker.
Right, something that doesn't change.
Exactly. Unlike testosterone levels, which naturally spike and dip or, can be artificially suppressed or altered over an athlete's lifetime, your genetic makeup is permanent. Whether you possess that SRY gene is a constant from birth. It removes the entire variable of time from the regulatory equation.
Which eliminates the need for all that ongoing medical surveillance of the athletes we just talked about.
Precisely. And the IOC's stated goal, according to the source, is to ensure fairness and safety. This is particularly focused on sports that demand explosive power, high-speed exertion, and intense physical endurance.
So, sports where physiology plays a massive direct role.
Yeah. The underlying argument the IOC is making is that athletes who possess male chromosomes, specifically the physical development, triggered by that SRY gene derive inherent unchangeable physiological advantages in those specific athletic areas.
Because that gene dictates the foundation of muscle density, bone structure, and lung capacity developed during puberty, which naturally leads us to look at the direct human consequences of this policy.
Right, the real-world impact.
If the IOC has installed this unyielding barcode scanner at the gate, who exactly gets turned away? How does this permanently alter the landscape of elite female athletes?
Well, the most immediate and explicitly stated impact of this ruling is that it entirely bars transgender women from competing in women's Olympic events.
And the source highlights Laurel Hubbard to illustrate this exact contrast, right? Laurel Hubbard is the New Zealand weightlifter who made global headlines when she competed at the Tokyo Olympics.
Yes, that's a perfect example.
Under the old, fragmented system, Hubbard was permitted to lift because she met the highly specific, individualized hormone suppression criteria set by the International Weightlifting Federation at that time. But under this new 2028 framework, simply because of the genetic SRY testing requirement, she would be permanently ineligible.
The ruling also heavily impacts athletes with differences in sexual development, often referred to as DSD. Specifically, the text notes it restricts eligibility for DSD athletes who have undergone male puberty, as their bodies have already benefited from the physiological developments we just discussed.
So what does this all mean for the absolute rigidness of the rule? Because, biology is rarely a perfect black and white binary. If an athlete has a Y chromosome and therefore possesses the SRY gene, is this a 100% blanket ban?
That's a great question.
Or is there any biological scenario where an athlete flags the genetic marker but doesn't actually reap the physical advantages?
There is actually a vital biological carve-out, detailed in the policy, that addresses exactly that scenario. The IOC has included limited exceptions for rare, specific conditions where the genetics do not match the physiological reality.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The primary exception the source focuses on is complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, or CAS.
Let's break down the mechanics of CIS because I think this is where the policy actually reveals its true intent. An individual with CIS will possess male chromosomes, including the SRY gene. So if we go back to our earlier analogy, the SRY gene acts as the ignition switch.
Right, it turns the engine on.
It flips on, sending the signal for the body to start producing male hormones, primarily testosterone. But with CAS, the body's androgen receptors are effectively unplugged.
The factory is producing the testosterone, but there are no loading docks available to receive it.
Right.
Because those cellular receptors are entirely insensitive to the hormone, the testosterone has absolutely no physical effect on the body.
The signal is sent, but it is never received. So the individual never undergoes male puberty. They don't develop the bone density, the muscle mass, or any of the testosterone-related performance advantages that the SRY gene usually initiates.
And honestly, what's fascinating here is how this specific medical exception exposes the IOC's underlying regulatory philosophy. I mean, if their goal was strictly about policing genetic identity, a Y chromosome would be an automatic, non-negotiable disqualification.
Yeah, a hard stop.
But By allowing the CAS exception, the IOC is demonstrating that their ultimate singular focus is on performance advantage. They are utilizing the genetic test as the most reliable tool to locate that physical advantage.
Right.
However, in a scenario like CIS, where the science definitively proves that the athletic advantage is biologically impossible to manifest despite the presence of the gene, the athlete is allowed to walk through the gate.
Which proves the policy is rooted entirely in evaluating physiological leverage rather than, making some blanket statement on human identity.
Exactly.
That distinction makes the mechanical application of the rule incredibly clear, but it opens up a massive historical question regarding the timeline. I mean, the underlying science of the SRY gene has been understood for decades.
Oh, absolutely.
Complete androgen insensitivity syndrome is not a new medical discovery. The IOC has employed panels of elite medical experts since the mid-20th century. If this biological framework has always existed, why is the IOC pulling the trigger on this massive, unprecedented, sport-altering shift right now? Why is Los Angeles 2028 the turning point?
To understand the urgency, we have to look at the immediate historical catalyst. The source identifies the Paris 2024 Olympics not just as a prior event, but as the absolute breaking point for the old regulatory system.
It was a mess.
Paris was an administrative meltdown.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you look back at the controversies in Paris, the defining conflicts weren't even necessarily about transgender athletes.
No, they were.
The crisis was born entirely out of the sheer administrative chaos of having competing rulebooks.
The global scrutiny during those games centered intensely on two specific athletes, Algerian boxer Imane Khelif and Taiwan's Lin Yuting. And it is vital to note that neither of these athletes are transgender.
Right, that got lost in a lot of the noise.
It did. Both women ultimately won gold medals in their respective weight classes in Paris. Yet their presence in the ring ignited an international firestorm because both athletes had previously been abruptly disqualified from an international world championship.
Over vague, heavily disputed eligibility concerns regarding their biology.
Exactly.
You had an absurd jurisdictional nightmare unfolding on the world stage. The International Boxing Association essentially told these athletes, you fail our specific undisclosed biological criteria, you are barred from the World Championships. Yeah.
But then the athletes walk into the Olympic Village, and the IOC, operating under an entirely different set of subjective standards, says, you meet our criteria, you are cleared to fight for gold.
And that total lack of a unified, standardized policy across different governing bodies created a volatile environment. The public was completely baffled. The media was operating on partial information. And the athletes themselves were subjected to unimaginable psychological stress and global scrutiny.
It created a severe crisis of confidence regarding the fundamental fairness of the competition. The IOC was forced to acknowledge that delegating these incredibly sensitive biological determinations to a fractured network of individual sports federations was just a failed experiment.
The source includes a highly revealing quote from IOC President Christy Coventry. She spearheaded an exhaustive 18-month consultation process leading up to this new genetic mandate.
Right, and Coventry's conclusion perfectly captures the institutional panic that followed Paris. She stated, and I quote, "At the Olympic Games, even the smallest margins can determine victory." And then she added, "It would not be fair, or in some cases safe, for biological males to compete in the female category."
That focus on the smallest margins is crucial context. We aren't talking about a recreational summer league here. We are talking about the absolute peak of human physical potential.
Where a gold medal is separated from fourth place by hundredths of a second or a fraction of an inch.
Exactly. And by explicitly pairing the concept of fairness with safety, Coventry is directly referencing the visceral nature of contact sports like boxing, which was, of course, the epicenter of the Paris controversy.
When physical striking is involved, physiological advantages cease to be just about who wins. They become a matter of bodily harm.
Yeah, the stakes are completely different.
Coventry's statement serves as the IOC's ultimate justification for seizing control. They're stepping in to mandate a centralized, unyielding biological line because the decentralized system failed to guarantee either fairness or safety to the satisfaction of the public or the athletes.
Yet, an institution as sprawling and influential as the International Olympic Committee doesn't draft policy in a vacuum. I mean, this rule change isn't just about the athletes lacing up their cleats or stepping into the boxing ring.
Definitely not.
This genetic standard is landing squarely in the middle of a fiercely contested, highly visible global dialogue. Elite sports are currently operating under a massive socio-political microscope.
The source makes a deliberate point to contextualize this scientific decision within a much broader political arena.
Yeah.
The global debate surrounding transgender participation in sports has reached a boiling point in recent years.
Oh, yeah.
And the IOC is acutely aware that the Olympic Games are the most visible cultural platform on Earth.
The location of the next games plays a massive role here, too. The source specifically zeroes in on the political climate in the United States, which is impossible to ignore given that the 2028 Games are being hosted in Los Angeles.
Right.
The IOC is preparing to bring their flagship, multi-billion-dollar event directly into the epicenter of a fierce domestic political battle.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the timeline of the policy and the geography of the next games are deeply intertwined. The text explicitly cites the U.S. political landscape, noting that former President Donald Trump had previously utilized executive orders to restrict transgender athletes from competing in women's sports.
Which sets a very specific stage.
Furthermore, the source highlights that he had publicly and explicitly stated his opposition to transgender athletes participating in the upcoming 2028 Olympic Games.
So, if you are the administrative body of the IOC, you're staring down the barrel of a potential public relations and political nightmare. You are bringing the games to a host country where the highest levels of political leadership have already weaponized the exact issue that caused administrative chaos at your last event.
It's a perfect storm.
How does that external high-stakes pressure accelerate the implementation of this SRY genetic test?
Well, you can clearly see the strategic, defensive maneuvering of a massive global institution here. By officially locking in what they define as a science-based standard years in advance of the Los Angeles opening ceremony, the IOC is actively attempting to preempt the impending political and social circus.
Get ahead of the story.
Exactly. They are rushing to establish a firm, unmoving biological rulebook long before the political machinery of an Olympic host nation can dictate the terms of the conversation.
They want the genetic barcode scanner to act as an impenetrable shield against domestic political interference. They can point to the laboratory and say, look, the science is settled, our hands are tied.
That is the exact administrative strategy. Now, whether a genetic test will actually succeed in silencing a deeply entrenched cultural debate remains highly unlikely, and the source itself predicts that this policy will absolutely continue to generate global controversy.
Naturally.
But from a purely bureaucratic standpoint, the SRY gene test provides the IOC with a definitive, standardized shield to deflect the immense political pressure they are guaranteed to face in 2028.
It is an overwhelming amount of scientific and political maneuvering to digest. Let's pull back and synthesize exactly what this means for you, our listener, and why the mechanics of this story matter far beyond the Olympic track.
That's a lot to take in.
The foundational takeaway here is that the IOC is executing one of the most radical shifts in sports eligibility in modern history. By the time the torch is lit in Los Angeles in 2028, the confusing, subjective, federation-by-federation hormone rules will be completely gone, replaced by a single SRY gene test.
A permanent shift.
This permanently shifts the criteria for women's Olympic sports, rooting eligibility firmly in unchanging biological markers, prioritizing the calculation of physiological advantage over personal identity.
And even if you never plan on stepping onto an Olympic podium, the mechanics of this decision offer a fascinating masterclass in institutional behavior. It shows how massive legacy organizations attempt to navigate and resolve incredibly complex, deeply nuanced human debates. When a global institution is faced with a spectrum of biological nuance, administrative chaos, and intense political outcry, they will almost always abandon subjectivity and search desperately for a binary scientific metric to act as an anchor.
Like a life raft.
Yes. The IOC surveyed the chaos of Paris and found their immovable anchor in the SRY gene. It is a striking example of how laboratory science, elite performance, and fierce societal pressure collide to rewrite the rules of human achievement.
They took an impossibly tangled regulatory web and aggressively reduced it down to a single drop of saliva.
They really did.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, there is one final, incredibly subtle detail buried in the source material that completely shifts how we should view the future of sports. And I want to leave you, our listener, with this thought to mull over.
Oh, what is the detail that stands out to you?
Well, the source makes a point to explicitly clarify that this new genetic mandate will not be applied retroactively to past medals, but more importantly, it strictly does not apply to grassroots, local, or amateur level sports.
Oh, Right.
The genetic barcode scanner we've been talking about only exists at the absolute highest peak, the final entry gate to the Olympics.
So the local high school tracks, the regional boxing clubs, the collegiate leagues, they remain entirely untouched by this specific IOC genetic mandate.
Exactly. So picture the reality of that disconnect for the next generation. If local and grassroots sports do not adopt this strict SRY genetic testing, if regional leagues continue to operate under a patchwork of different inclusion rules or fluctuating hormone standards, how will future young athletes navigate that whiplash?
That's a profound question.
Imagine a young athlete growing up, dedicating over a decade of their life to training, competing, and winning against a specific cohort of peers under one set of local rules. They build their entire identity around this pursuit only to finally reach the elite Olympic level and discover that the fundamental definition of who they are legally allowed to compete against completely flips the moment they try to walk through that final gate.
That's jarring.
The white lines on the field might look exactly the same, but the biological reality of the competition will have been completely rewritten overnight. It is a looming collision between local inclusion and elite biological gating. Something to really think about as we head toward 2028. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Okay, one question for you. With the International Olympic Committee introducing a rule that restricts women's Olympic events to biological females through SRY gene testing, do you believe this decision promotes fairness in competition or limits inclusivity for transgender athletes? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.